Title Update 4 has brought some pretty big changes to weapon balance, not by actual weapon mechanics or motion value changes, but through the skills it introduced. Frostcraft, Dragon Conversion, and Mail of Hellfire as an augment have made the majority of weapons a lot stronger than in tu4. A consequence of this is that freestyle speedrunning is faster and therefore easier than before. The more damage you do, the less time it takes to kill a monster, meaning easier scripting, easier CCs, and less AI RNG that could screw you over. Before tu5 comes along with its weapon balance changes, I'd just like to give an overview of the relative strength and difficulty of melee weapons in the current patch. Strength will be gauged solely by clear times, whilst difficulty will relate to mechanical skill requirements, scripting difficulty, and reliance on AI RNG. Note that these metrics will only apply to freestyle speedrunning and are not relevant to casual hunts or even to TA Wiki speedruns. Also, just because I rate a weapon as easy or hard, it doesn't mean the runners or players of easy weapons are worse than runners or players of hard weapons. These ratings are kind of a baseline for a high level play or a decent freestyle speedrun, but to achieve perfection and truly optimal play, the skill ceiling is basically unreachable for any weapon. The best players for all weapons, easy or hard, are each and all insanely good. So here is a chart that has two axes, strong versus weak, easy versus hard. For this video I'd like to split out some weapons by playstyle because these playstyles can be very different in terms of strength and difficulty. First is Greatsword, which got Frostcraft in tu4. It is stupidly strong with strong arm stance. It was already the strongest weapon in tu3 and now it just gets 30% more damage. This insane strength also makes it an easy weapon to run. So like any non-elder monster below 6 stars, it just gets dumpstered with copy-paste scripts, in which speedrunners just need to calculate how many TCS it takes to kill at minimum, and just trap, ride, trap, etc. into capture. For elder dragons, you just need to deal with a bit of AI RNG to get the right moves to counter, some good pet RNG to get the right sleep timings, manage your health a little to not get chipped to death while in heroics range, and then the monster's dead in 2 minutes. The scripting is a bit harder to optimize with aura tupples, risen tupples, head breaks, sleep timing and whatever, but it can be calculated a lot more easily than for other weapons because you do these huge individual chunks of damage. Overall, TCS Greatsword is off the charts in damage and one of the easier weapons to run. Another Greatsword playstyle that has emerged involves spamming Hunting Edge into Plunging Thrust. This playstyle outputs a lot of elemental damage, so it has benefited from Mail of Hellfire augments. Additionally, unlike with TCS Greatsword, dual chain dogs do a lot of damage in this playstyle because they'll do the spinning attack on every Hunting Edge. I've seen a few people doing runs on it and I think it's funny so I've included it, but it's not really a speedrun viable playstyle since it is just outright inferior to strong arm TCS. Mechanically, there is some execution required to properly aim and time the plunger despite how easy it looks, but it's not particularly difficult either, and can be pretty brain dead to run. It is probably overall harder to get a good run with than a regular TCS Greatsword playstyle because you will have to rely on AI RNG rather than being able to script the whole fight from start to finish. In fact, you don't really script at all for plunger runs and just have to pray that everything works out. In terms of strength, the plunger is actually stronger than the weaker weapons and playstyles despite being firmly off meta, but it's not actually good. The second strongest weapon in tu3, Longsword, didn't get as much benefit from tu4 as some other weapons did. Frostcraft doesn't work too well with the special sheath EI and reimposed counter-based playstyle because it just doesn't sheath for long enough. However, this playstyle is still very strong, particularly against aggressive endgame monsters with its safe, fast, and damaging counters. In terms of scripting, there isn't too much to script apart from the initial Adrenaline and Harvest Moon setup, because this playstyle mostly relies on good monster knowledge, positioning, getting good AI RNG, and good execution. It can be frustrating to run on less cooperative monsters, especially those who like to use long range attacks or are mobile enough to exit Harvest Moon's radius, but it doesn't require a huge effort from the player to create like a genius script or do anything too insane execution wise. There are cases where the skill ceilings for prediction, reactions and execution get really high, like this multi-monster quest by Finks that I'm showing on screen, but for a regular one monster quest, if you know what to do to bait out variable attacks and counter them, the monster basically kills itself. So I'd place counter longsword around here because as stated before it still is strong, and it doesn't require too much thinking, just good fundamentals. Longsword's other playstyle with sacred sheath has gotten relatively stronger because it can utilize frostcraft. It still isn't as strong as the counter-based special sheath playstyle overall, but it wins out in certain matchups that don't give many counter opportunities, have poor moves or hit zones for counters, or just give big windows for sacred sheath, such as Valstrax, Volcana, or Chaotic Gore. Sacred sheath isn't as mechanically taxing as special sheath, and is a bit less influenced by AI RNG, instead relying on the runner's scripting ability. In a way it's similar to Greatsword, setting up its big damaging attack, but it requires a lot more thinking and setup to do so because the move is slower in both preparation and execution than a strong arm TCS. Sacred Sheath is slower than counter longsword and doesn't look as cool subjectively, but I asked Finks himself and he says it's harder because of the scripting difficulties, juggling natural monster CC thresholds, external CC options and mount damage from Sakura Slash, whilst setting up Sacred Sheath combos. Sword and Shield's dominant playstyle revolves around Metsu. Against regular monsters, SNS runs are basically as simple as Greatsword runs to script and execute. You Metsu to KO, Metsu to ride, trap to Metsu, trap to capture, etc. SNS can have a lot of mechanical skill expression, but that's more a TA wiki thing. With freestyle the focus is a good script, which lets you lock down the monster and minimize reliance on AI RNG. There's a bit more actual fighting involved against elders, but you still have plenty of CC to just knock them down repeatedly. In terms of strength, Metsu SNS didn't get too much from tu4, because Frostcraft doesn't synergize well with Windmantle. Your Metsu will hit harder with Frostcraft, but you'll be able to do less of them, which ends up being a bad trade. Furthermore, the elemental damage buffs help Metsu SNS less relative to other weapons, because its elemental damage output isn't that high, even when you're actually using the sword combos. So overall, Metsu SNS sits around here. It's relatively fast and easy to run against most monsters. With the elemental damage buffs though, another SNS playstyle has become viable, Windmill. This is useful in matchups where raw hit zones are low relative to elemental hit zones, and there are few Metsu opportunities. Since freestyle allows traps, anything that can be trapped can be barrel Metsu'd, so Windmill is really only used on the elders that fit the previous criteria, Chameleos, Risen Chameleos, and Volcana. The exception to this is Diablos because the head isn't good to Metsu even though he can be trapped. Windmill's very generous iframes and SNS's backup and general mobility make this playstyle relatively safe, in that it's pretty easy not to die even when running Adrenaline, and there isn't too much to it scripting wise. Windmill in fact has so many iframes in the move itself, and such a large radius that there are less bad moves that monster can do against it compared to, for example, specific moves that Metsu would need to be on a counter, so AI RNG is less of an issue. Conversely though, the move can be very annoying to deal with as it tends to magnetize towards seemingly random hit zones. It's not particularly mechanically or mentally taxing to run when you just spam Windmill, but damage wise it's nothing special either. Dual Blade's got a huge buff from tu4, benefiting from Mail of Hellfire augments and its situational ability to run Frostcraft. With Frostcraft Spiral Slashes, most regular monsters die basically as quickly and easily as with Strong Arm TCS Greatsword. It allows for the copy-paste trap, mount, trap, cap scripts. Against endgame monsters like Risen Elders, Frostcraft loses value because you'd rather just output constant damage and not sheath. Instead, you can run Dango Driver plus Dango Adrenaline, or just use a Berserk set to get the max drive buff, which lets you run around in infinite stamina demon mode. You'll be incredibly mobile, and both Demon Flight and Shrouded Vault have plentiful iframes. This mobility and safety lessens the impact of AI moveset RNG relative to other weapons, as you'll be able to maintain aggression against the majority of a monster's moveset. Spiral Slash's consistent targeted damage also makes scripting relatively simple in terms of tracking and beating key thresholds such as part breaks or Wyvern Ride. I would say overall Spiral Slash Dual Blades are slightly easier to run than Greatsword because they're just as brain dead on shit ones, and they're easier against endgame monsters due to lower reliance on AI RNG and sleep timing. The damage isn't as insane, but it's still pretty strong. Some monsters have only one good elemental hit zone that can't be targeted by Spiral. The only ones I can think of in this category are Mitsune and its variants, since you can script Valstrax and Risen Valstrax using Spiral to kill them before or just as they enrage. For the Mizus though, you have to use Demon Flurry Rush and Blade Dance to chop their feet. Dual Blades still perform well with this approach. This approach is just a bit more mechanically difficult than the Spiral playstyle because actually hitting Mizu feet can be really annoying on some moves, and especially on topples, but scripting wise and AI RNG wise it's almost as simple. Chop feet is one of the most specific and esoteric optimal playstyles in the game, only winning the Mizitsune matchups in tu4, but it is pretty effective. Where dual blades does become difficult and significantly weaker is against monsters that don't have any accessible or favourable elemental hit zones. Piercing Bind still exists despite being completely overshadowed by Spiral Slash for most monsters. At this point in Sunbreak though, I'm not even sure if Piercing Bind would beat Spiral on Astalos or the Gore Magala and Magnamalo variants' 15 element hit zone heads. And Magna's hind legs are 25 element if you want to try and chop its feet. But hypothetically, if you had to use Piercing Bind, its damage output is pretty poor, it's hard to play, and due to the move's long setup time, tiny range, and the long commitment required to maximize damage, it requires a pretty tight script. Also, the optimal sets for Piercing Bind may require you to use Status Trigger and iframe with the dash to maintain somewhat decent damage output. When not using Piercing Bind, your damage output from Demon Flight follow-ups will matter a lot more than the Spiral playstyle. In a Spiral playstyle, you'd probably just go for a Spiral after Demon Flight anyway, but with this playstyle, you need to aim the Aerial Flurry and its follow-ups well to maximize damage. This playstyle is a lot more mechanically involved, AI RNG dependent, and is hard to make a good script for, all while dealing significantly less damage. Next is Hammer. Courage Hammer pretty much wins all matchups, even the raw damage oriented ones. It's a very simple playstyle mechanically and conceptually. You spam the charge combo into a monster's head, and ideally the monster doesn't get the move. On weaker monsters it might be almost as easy as Greatsword or Dual Blades if you can lock them down with KOs and flinches. However, on monsters with more HP and higher KO and flinch thresholds, Courage Hammer requires a very well planned script and a little bit of good RNG to lock them down, because you might actually have to fight the monster for brief periods. With the huge element buffs Hammer got in tu4, not just from Mail of Hellfire but also the absurd augment slot bonus it gets, which is the highest in the game, I believe it is just barely past Metsu SNS in the overall matchup spread. Strength is unfortunately the weaker option for Hammer. Due to not scaling off element in Sunbreak, a very element heavy game, it has gradually fallen behind in terms of damage output. The biggest point of difference is that Chain Dogs are much less effective with Strength Hammer than Courage Hammer. On higher tier monsters where Courage has good CC potential outside of KOs with head flinches, and superior mobility and versatility due to the nature of its charge attacks and water strike follow-ups, Strength can feel a bit sluggish, and is afforded less opportunities for aggression in exchange for its higher burst damage with Brutal Big Bang and or Impact Crater. There are still some monsters like Valstrax however, where Strength is competitive, as Enrage Valstrax's head does not take elemental damage, and the fact that he's scripted very well with Strength's moveset. However, Strength's reliance on longer punish windows in neutral play, and less mobility and versatility in moveset, makes AI RNG more impactful and scripting more difficult. Next is Hunting Horn, and if you know anything about speedrunning, then you shouldn't be surprised to see that this weapon is weak. And not only is it weak, I think it is relatively hard. As I said earlier, the less damage your weapon does, the longer it takes to hit key thresholds and the longer the run lasts, which gives more time for things to go wrong. And things can go very wrong with Hunting Horn. The weapon has low mobility and the swings are all very slow, and your only defensive options are Silkman Shockwave Super Armor or Performance's iframes. If you're trying to get the best possible speedrun times, Super Armor is not an option because you'll die if you're in Heroics range, and you want to be running Heroics in Freestyle, and Performance isn't an option because Echo just does more damage than it. Not having a counter or a mobility skill in Sunbreak is pretty painful. Horn is also held back by the need to refresh Silkman Shockwave every 30 seconds or risk losing anywhere from 20 to 40% of its damage output. In raw focus matchups where Sonic Bloom is the best damage source, scripting can be difficult because it moves very slow to set up and its damage can be hard to connect to specific hit zones should you require a certain part break. With Horn in general, it's not so much mechanical skill that's required, it's more heavily reliant on good positioning and split-second decision making to maximize damage when the monster is fighting back, and carefully tracking KO and ride build up to manage CC properly, in case you don't want the monster to fight back. Lance is one of the most nuanced weapons in terms of playstyles, as the playstyles aren't as separate and distinct as with other weapons. For the sake of simplicity, I've split it into the Leaping Thrust playstyle, which focuses on elemental damage, and the Spiral or Skyward Thrust playstyles, which focus on raw damage. Almost all Lance's switch skills are speedrun viable though, and these playstyles get blurred depending on what switch skill combinations a runner prefers. The Leaping Thrust style benefited from the general element buffs, and has pulled ahead of the more raw focused playstyles. For the switch heals, it runs Guard Dash to access Leaping Thrust, and generally uses Anchor Rage, but can run Skyward Thrust in specific matchups like Chameleos. If you watch Leaping Thrust runs, they can look kind of easy and brain dead, just spamming Guard Dash through attacks and maybe sometimes insta-blocking, but it requires matchup knowledge to maintain the right rhythm and not overextend with the aggression. There isn't much in terms of scripting in leaping thrust runs, but it is very AI RNG reliant. If the monster moves out of range, the limit to mobility's playstyle becomes an issue. You'll need the monster to do the moves that give you the most instant counters, or keeps it within range of your leaping thrusts. Spiral thrust and skyward thrust playstyles are favoured in matchups which are more raw damage oriented. These playstyles are more technical than leaping thrust. They require the same degree of good AI RNG to maintain the damage uptime, but the steel-brain skills that output the majority of the damage in these playstyles can be finicky and require good execution and monster knowledge to use. These styles also allow for more specific scripting than leaping thrust because of the easily trackable ride build-up that steel-brain's output. Overall, because these styles don't scale with element, they are generally slower in clear times than leaping thrust, but there are specific matchups where skyward thrust is very strong. On Geismagorm, it can consistently land max hits, and it has a silly ledge cancel tech against Nawa. The other lance playstyle, gunlance, is very different. Gunlance got almost nothing from tu4 since it doesn't really scale with element and Frostcraft isn't that usable on it, so hunting on with its buffed element has actually caught up to it in terms of strength. Gunlance relies heavily on blast dash for mobility, defense and offense. Proper execution of blast dashes requires good timing, positioning and aim. It can iframe or dodge moves and lead to attacks as a sort of pseudo counter. You want to either ensure you hit the monster's head to build KO, or position yourself to get the optimal slam or hail cutter. Scripting with gunlance can be complex to optimize. You pretty much always get a hellfire topper from blast dash and a ride from hail cutter, but deciding when or whether it's worth it to pursue a KO with blast dashes or get certain part break toppers with the power of your fixed damage requires more trial and error than with most weapons. It's partly due to the fact that gunlance runs are inherently longer, so scripting gets more complex, and also partly due to the fact that these KOs or part breaks aren't thresholds that you necessarily reach if you're playing just to maximize damage. Unlike, say, Hammer, which will always hit head and will basically be forced to get a KO within a certain window of time, gunlance has to be a little more deliberate to grab its way to blast dash KO, and can time it to be any point in the run. Switch axe has fallen off a little in comparison to charge blade and dual blades because it doesn't scale as hard with element, but it still outputs a lot of damage, and is relatively consistent in performance against both elemental and raw based matchups. However, against stronger monsters, Swax isn't as simple as the other strong weapons. This is because its high commitment moves, low mobility and slow counter make it easy to overextend, and in terms of scripting, Swax has little natural CC. Exhaust files exist but will only net you at most 2 KOs and are not viable in most matchups because of much lower damage, and running Hellfire Cloak is difficult because Swax has a high skill tax. Elemental Burst Counter is sort of overrated. It's not that crazy in terms of damage, the long wind up limits the moves it can be used against reactively, the huge swings often clip bad hit zones, and the hit lag and recovery time can get you killed. Swax relies heavily on good matchup knowledge and AI RNG, as well as good positioning, timing and execution, to sneak in as much damage as possible into whatever windows you get, and to set up effective counters preemptively. With Charge Blade, it's basically been two separate weapons since the start of Rise. Historically, CSS Charge Blade had been stronger since it could scale with Dango, Adrenaline and Heroics, but since Sunbreak Title Update 1, Elemental Power Creep had begun to favour SAD Charge Blade. SAD Charge Blade is one of the weapons that benefits greatly from Dragon conversion and runs over Strife and Melve Hellfire, as it basically does 90% elemental damage that doesn't scale with crit. Individual files now hit almost as hard as full SADs from base Sunbreak. This has actually served to make the weapon easier to run with. There is less chance that SADs trade with monsters because they are more likely to flinch, and some silly triplocks like the Nagakuga variants are much easier. This is not to say the playstyle is easy though. Precise positioning and movement as well as good monster knowledge is necessary to bait out the best moves from monsters and land all files in the best hit zones. There isn't much in terms of scripting apart from getting a quick engage and opening, and finding the best Hellfire topple timing. Like with Counter Longsword, this style mostly relies on cooperative AI for a good run. CSS Charge Blade does benefit from Melve Hellfire augments, but nowhere near as much as SAD benefits from Dragon conversion. The power gap between the two playstyles has widened further, and pretty much every matchup where SAD can connect with a 20+ element hit zone is SAD favoured. The CSS playstyle requires good scripting with KOs and Hellfire usage to lock monsters down. It can quite effectively lock down weaker monsters, which makes for relatively simple runs, but it becomes exponentially harder against stronger monsters that will eventually have an opportunity to fight back. Against these monsters, CSS is quite mechanically difficult, as it is one of the least mobile playstyles in the game and will rely heavily on proper positioning, movement and timing. It does have a shield, but it still feels risky to play a switch axe, in that to maintain good DPS you have to take some risks. For example, high level CSS players will try to use EV2 swings in windows that aren't 100% safe, but will cancel the CSS ticks early if they need a block on reaction. Lastly, we have insect glaive. Mechanically, I thought insect glaive wasn't too hard, but I play mouse and keyboard. For those on controller, aiming like insect slashes and diving wyverns on moving targets can be pretty difficult. Glaive runs might look simplistic with the flying around and poking the monster from the skies, but it's very matchup and AI dependent. Some monsters are free to insect slash, whilst others have very annoying movement patterns, huge aerial hitboxes, and tiny heads that make it hard to aim and sustain an aerial combo without very good moveset knowledge and RNG. However, this is freestyle. Glaive has access to a lot of CC options with Hellfire topples, KOs with blunt kinsect, and easy to track and script ride build up. These allow to basically lock down weaker monsters and reduce the reliance on air RNG for stronger monsters. The new tu4 skills aren't that great for glaive, its aerial playstyle is very raw damage heavy and can't benefit from Frostcraft, whilst grounded Tetrasteel slash combos do benefit from Mail of Hellfire augments, but not as much as more element heavy weapons. So this is the final list. I'm sure other experienced runners may have different opinions when it comes to weapon strength and difficulty, and I'm interested in hearing any opinions people may have, in case I've said something stupid or misleading. Of course, this chart only applies to freestyle speedruns and is generalized across the weapon or playstyle's matchup spread, and each weapon has some specific matchups that may be free or give it hell. This chart has no relevance at all to casual hunts. For example, strong arm TCS greatsword is really hard to play effectively in multiplayer, while something like hunting horn becomes a lot easier. But please let me know if you have any questions or issues or want clarification on any points I've raised. Thanks for watching.